It's a classic story. Good versus evil, light versus dark, the holy versus the profane, God versus the devil. These basic elements serve as the foundation for media of all kinds, but there perhaps may not be any so famously as the tale of Dracula. Simon Belmont, an avatar of heroism, Dracula, the Prince of Darkness, and a literary character steeped with lore stretching back to Bram Stoker's famous novel. Actually, tales of Dracula go back even further than that, back to the 18th century, maybe even older. It's hard to know when and where the old folk stories about creatures of the night truly began. One thing is clear, Dracula is embedded in our culture today, and he has certainly left his unholy mark on gaming. Greetings, I'm Old Man Zoo, and this is the Symbolism of Castlevania. Now, earlier I called our hero Simon Belmont because, well, everyone knows that's what his name is. Second game in the series is even named after him, Castlevania Simon's Quest. But really, if we look at the game's NES manual, Simon's name is nowhere to be found. This is fascinating to me. The manual speaks to you in the second person, quote, "Step in the shadows of the deadliest dwelling on earth. You've arrived at Castlevania, and you're here on business to destroy forever the curse of the evil count." End quote. What's more is that Dracula himself is never directly referenced by name in either the manual or the game. Instead, the NES manual just calls him the Count. Surely this was to avoid some perceived legal entanglements on Konami's part, but that's just my theory. For the sake of everyone's sanity, I'm going to call them Simon and Dracula, and to be fair, Simon gets called Simon over in Europe, and he kinda does in the US version too, but more on that in a bit. Now, other than calling our hero Simon and our villain Dracula, I'm going to do my best to just stick with what we can glean from the game and the game's manual. And the reason I try to do this is because it'd be very tempting to sort of pull from games that if you were playing this back when it came out, you'd have no idea, you'd have no knowledge of. And so you really have to try to take each of these games as its own entity and you can look back in time, but not forward in time. Or at least that's what I'm limiting myself to. And so I'm going to coin a term for this. I'm going to call it game scope. We're going to just limit ourselves from what we can get from the game and the game's materials. Okay, so after Simon storms the gates of Castlevania, he finds himself facing down the many denizens of the castle. Even though it's not explicitly stated, I think it's fair to say that these bosses are subservient to Dracula. We have the giant bat, Medusa, the twin mummies, Frankenstein's monster, along with a flea man enemy that probably represents Igor, and finally, Death himself. But before I get too far ahead, let's talk a little bit of history, a little bit of development, and a little bit of localization. Now, I know what you're thinking, there's a billion videos and sources on Castlevania history, old man. This is boring. And, well, you're absolutely right, which is why I'm just going to give you a few of my favorite highlights, and for those that want to know more, I'll see if I can leave some links in the description. Now, first cool thing, Castlevania's creative team is not actually mentioned in the credits, at least not directly. It's a little weird, a little bit confusing. Did Trans Fisher actually create Castlevania? How about Bram Stoker? Not likely. No, if we listen to other developers floating around Konami, we can say with a certain level of confidence that a man by the name of Hitoshi Akamatsu was the team lead behind Castlevania. Hitoshi was also responsible for Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, Castlevania 3, and Snake's Revenge. And oh boy, can we talk about Snake's Revenge. Not this episode, it'll be another episode. Metal Gear will be an episode. Metal Gear Solid, all that stuff. We'll get to that, but not now. All right. So, and here we go. There's the U.S. mention of Simon Belmont. Well, Belmondo. All right. Second cool thing, Akamajo Dracula, Devil's Castle Dracula, the original name of the game. It was localized for us Americans to Castlevania. Why? Don't know, and I had a hard time trying to find any definitive answer. If I had to guess, it's probably a portmanteau of Castle and Transylvania, Transylvania being the legendary home of Dracula, or maybe even a reference to Castle plus Transylvania plus Mania. I imagine Nintendo of America was a bit squeamish referencing the devil directly in the game's title, Nintendo had a tendency to be a bit sensitive to religious iconography, although the policy wasn't applied particularly evenly. Third cool thing, Mr. Akamatsu liked Western movies, and Simon's weapon of choice was inspired by none other than Indiana Jones. I'd show you a cool clip of Indiana Jones here, but copyright stuff. Okay, enough history. Let's talk about the different versions real quick. So there are 4-ish versions of Castlevania, kinda. So really, there's 3 versions of Castlevania that are definitely and unmistakably Castlevania 1. The very first version was released for the Famicom Disk System back in 1986 in Japan. A year later, the US got it on the Nintendo Entertainment System. These 2 versions are pretty close other than the expected regional differences, and in my opinion, the US got the cooler title screen. I mean, look at that bat. A few years later in '93, Japan saw a re-release of the US version for the Famicom, so 3 solid versions of the game. So why do I say 4? Vampire Killer. This game was likely developed by a separate team in tandem with the original Akumajo Dracula. What sets it apart are some of the minor things and a few major things. You get a couple of cool items that I wish we would have seen in the NES Castlevania, but were likely cut due to the religious themes, including different types of crosses and Bibles. There was also more of a focus on getting treasure chests. Vampire Killer actually came out before the US release of Castlevania, but a mere month after the Japanese release. It's interesting to think that Vampire Killer could have been the very first Castlevania game. Seems like the Castlevania team was just a little bit faster. There's a lot of things to cover here. Let's start at the title screen. First off, notice how the title screen is framed with little white blocks. These are actually meant to be the sprocket holes on the side of a film strip. This is a reference to Akamatsu's love of movies, the idea being that playing Castlevania could be like playing your very own horror game and populated by a slew of classic movie monsters. Next thing worth noting is the C in Castlevania. Notice those little flourishes at the top and bottom. These look like the architectural embellishments of Gothic architecture. But not just any old Gothic architecture, but something called flamboyant Gothic architecture. Flamboyant. The idea at the time was to make churches look like they were on fire, a uniform fire burning with divine fury and light. It makes sense then that the flamboyant style as it is applied to Castlevania itself would invert that intent, making the castle a sort of perverted church, radiating evil rather than holy light. In contrast, the rest of the title in Castlevania looks old, weathered, ancient. Could this be a reference to its ancient master? Maybe it hints at the decay hiding just behind the exuberant, ornate facade of the castle. Seems appropriate. After all, vampires are often depicted with an attractive exterior, masking the death and unholiness within. It's the familiar tale of how seductive sin can be. Well, we've taken a quick look at the title screen. What about the rest of the game? Well, there's a lot here, and it's amazing just how much the developers managed to say with just a little intro like this. But before we dive in too deep into this opening, let's talk about our hero, Simon Belmont. It's an interesting name, but not outlandish, and not too obvious either. The name Simon is an old Hebrew name meaning he has heard or listened. Now, this may not seem particularly relevant. I mean, what does that have to do with slaying vampires? Well, it gets more interesting when you start looking at biblical characters in the Bible named Simon. 2 immediately pop up. First, and arguably the most famous biblical Simon, is Simon Peter. He was a disciple of Jesus Christ and is largely attributed as being the first pope and founder of the Christian faith. That's a pretty significant holy reference, naming your character after the founder of Christianity. But it gets better. The other, less famous Simon was also a disciple of Christ, and his name was Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot. He was given this name because he was willing to defend his faith violently if need be. Some even thought he might have been Jesus' brother. And what better name to give your vampire killer than to name him after a famous holy warrior, a zealot opposed to evil. Then there's the name Belmont. In French, it means beautiful mountain, but if we dig a little bit deeper, we find that the name is older than France itself. This name might originate back to the time of the Norman civilization. The Normans were basically Vikings that conquered and colonized what is today northern France. And what's another name one might use to describe Vikings? Brutal, savage, conquerors, barbarians? I think it's interesting that Simon Belmont looks like a man dressed up as a barbarian warrior, and his name could be interpreted as meaning something like zealot of the beautiful mountain, or maybe even barbarian warrior of the faith. And as a brief aside, mountains are important in Christianity. Moses ascends Mount Sinai, symbolically getting closer to God, communing with his creator and receiving the Ten Commandments. So in a way, before the game has even really started, we see this barbarian descended from the mountaintop, ready to become a vampire killer. Now what about Simon's whip? We know from later games that this whip is called Vampire Killer, but if we're to constrain ourselves to game scope, then we should look at what the manual calls it. Magical whip. Well, let's go with that and see what we can glean from that. So when I think of a whip, I think of a tool used to tame wild animals. You don't see many medieval soldiers charging to battle with whips, and usually when you think of a barbarian or a Viking, you think of a big broadaxe. Now we already know that Akamatsu likes the whip because he was a fan of Indiana Jones, but maybe there's something more to this weapon. If a regular whip is used to tame a regular animal, would a magical whip be used to tame a magical one? And maybe to stretch and substitute the name magical with a nearby synonym, we could call it a supernatural whip. And maybe that supernatural whip is taming a supernatural animal. According to the manual, the Count has been waiting for a rematch for 100 years. So we can say that Dracula represents a sort of unkillable evil that must be subdued. It can't be killed, but it has to be conquered, it has to be dominated. So what better way to tame evil than with a whip? Alright, so we've got Simon Belmont, we've got his magical whip. I think we're ready to tackle the first level. So we can't very well talk about Simon Belmont and not talk about his sub-weapons. And boy, does he have sub-weapons. And daggers, holy water, a watch, a spinning cross, and an axe. I mean, some of this stuff is kind of relevant to Vampire Hunter, but an axe? Well, let's delve into Simon Belmont's host of holy and hallowed habiliments and divine devices, both devout and devious. Let's take them one at a time. The dagger. So daggers from a religious context are often used as a means of committing a sacrifice. It was standard practice for early followers of God to sacrifice their livestock. Sometimes the sacrifice was meant as a means of penance for having sinned against God or another of God's followers. Sometimes it was meant to garner blessings from God during a major life event, such as the birth of a child. The ritual sacrifice itself was carefully laid out as to how it was performed and who could perform it. But when you think of roughly the time period when Castlevania might take place for the purposes of this game, we don't really have an explicit date, but if we confine ourselves to game scope, we can try to derive the time period from the clues we're given. And since we have a large clock tower in this game, I think we can safely say we're more contemporary than the time of animal sacrifice. If anyone was still performing ritual sacrifice at this time period, roughly, it was probably with sinister intent. So, if the dagger isn't a holy symbol, why does Simon use it? I think it's because of this guy, Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker. Yes, at the end of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Prince of Darkness is not staked to death in his sleep, he's not burnt to cinders by sunlight, no, he's stabbed to death with knives. It could be that Simon Belmont's daggers are a reference to the weapons that killed Dracula in the very book that popularized Dracula to begin with. Alright, let's move on to the firebomb. Okay, I say firebomb, but everybody knows this is supposed to be holy water. So, I remember playing Castlevania and seeing the little vampire hunter on screen throw a vial of water on the ground and it erupted in red flame. I mean, even as a little kid playing this, I intuited that to mean holy water. So why Konami localized this weapon to be called a firebomb might have something to do with Nintendo's prohibition on religious references, which we've mentioned before. Or it could be that this was genuinely meant to be like a sort of Molotov cocktail that Simon tosses around. But regardless of whether you consider it to be a firebomb or consider it holy water, I think the central theme of its use and symbolism is pretty similar. Holy water is simply water that has been sanctified by a member of the clergy. Usually we think of Christian clergy, but really maybe any holy clergy might do when we're thinking of the holy and unholy in a sort of macro level. From the supernatural mythos, we're led to believe that holy water scalds and burns the unholy. I've always been really drawn to that idea that the holy is linked to the light, that there's holy fire. Fire has a transmutative effect and is generally a symbol of enlightenment when presented in a controlled state, such as a lamp or a torch. Just as you would use a fire to purify water to smelt and remove impurities from a particular ore, the holy water, or a firebomb, would be a fire that would cleanse the world of evil. Also, this fits in well with the imagery of nearly all the enemies bursting into flames when they die from being struck by the whip. So it's just a continual theme of holy fire burning away the evil. Alright, so here we go with the watch. This one's a little tricky because of maybe how obvious it is. What I mean by that is the symbolism itself seems pretty self-evident. Time is measured by clocks, and in this case a watch. The tricky part is trying to figure out how a watch could be a holy symbol. When I initially started thinking about this, I sort of waved it away as, well, not every sub-weapon has to be holy. I mean, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But I did come up with a way to link this to holy stuff. Just bear with me, I'm not going to make any wild leaps, just some observations about time. So what is time exactly? Well, it's a sort of construct to help us organize our existence. There's plenty of cliches in the media linking time and mortality. As mortal creatures, we all have a finite amount of time. It's really the crux of our mortality. In this way, the watch is a strong symbol of mortality. By contrast, the undead defy mortality. They've used up their lifespan, they've run down the clock, and yet they rise again in defiance of what was allotted to them. Perhaps when Simon Belmont activates the watch, he is actually not stopping time, but starting it for the undead. For a brief moment, the watch ticks, and it anchors the undead back into a sort of rational construct, a state where they are dead because time is now acting upon them. When the watch ceases to tick, the undead become once again unmoored from the laws of nature, and they begin to move. Time is order, the undead chaos. Order and chaos, which, alluding back to the very beginning of this video where I talked about light and darkness and evil and the divine. Here's a quote from the Bible just to kind of back this up. "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, and that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness." Genesis 1, chapter 2 through 4. Okay, enough about time. Let's move on to the boomerang. Well, or the cross. Or the boomerang. Just depends on where we're looking at. But you're not really wrong to call this a cross, but it would be a mistake to call it a crucifix. Now, in my mind as a child, I always assumed this was meant to be a cross like I saw in church, but was sort of made into an X shape due to gameplay needing to have a nice, even-looking projectile to throw. But I think there's something more to this. The crosses in church were Latin crosses, where one beam of the cross is longer and offset from the other. A Latin cross is a pretty unmistakable symbol of the Catholic Church and now symbolizes the whole of Christendom, basically both Catholic and Protestant, and basically any flavor of Christianity uses the Latin cross nowadays. But the cross that Simon throws is very clearly constructed with two identically sized beams, centered and laid perpendicular to each other. This is a Greek cross. Greek crosses actually predate Christianity and are thought to have originally been a symbol of order, which, again, tying into that idea of the holy being orderly. So later, this cross was adopted to represent the spread of the Christian gospel, with each arm of the cross representing the four cardinal directions. In the case of Castlevania, this might be representative of St. Andrew's Cross, also known as the Saltire. We see the Saltire present in the flags of many historically Christian nations, and this was called St. Andrew's Cross because St. Andrew was thought to be bound and martyred on a sideways Greek cross. The story goes that St. Andrew requested to be crucified sideways because he felt unworthy to be executed in the same manner that Jesus Christ was. There's a very similar story with St. Peter, except he was crucified on an upside-down Latin cross, which I guess it's not funny, but I always thought it was amusing that you see the upside-down cross in a lot of media sort of portrayed as some sort of satanic symbol, which is just silly. If you know anything about history, the upside-down cross is still a holy symbol. It has nothing to do with Satan worship. So if you have some edgy friend with an upside-down cross or an upside-down cross tattoo, Hate to break it to you, it's still a Christian symbol. Anyway, let's move on. So why does the Greek cross act as a boomerang when Simon Belmont throws it? I'm not really sure what the significance of this is. It may just be meant to have been a boomerang sub-weapon. Keep in mind, I'll be reading comments, so if you guys have an idea of why this would be used as a boomerang, if there's some sort of symbolic significance, I'll read it. I think I'll make a follow-up video and sort of base it on comments that I read, because I'm going to take into serious consideration comments, and if you guys provide some valid points or some valid interpretations of these symbols, I want to know about it. I want to kind of expand my own horizons on this. Okay, so let's move on to the other cross in this game. This one's pretty obvious. It's the Latin cross linked to a necklace. I think the symbolism and media context is pretty straightforward. Crosses have been shown to ward away Dracula, so it only seems to make sense that the Latin cross could be a room-clearing weapon. This symbol represents probably one of the most potent figures in Christian history, so it follows that such a powerful symbol would have such an immediate cleansing effect on evil. Alright, so here is the axe. The axe, you might be thinking, surely there's no way to establish an axe as some sort of divine symbol. But it's actually not so far-fetched. The axe represents strength. Usually warriors are represented by the symbol of the axe or the sword. It's a very old tool. The axe has been with humanity for a long time, and the axe's history stretches back to ancient religious practices when decorative axes were often used as gifts to the god. And just to kind of touch back on the axe representing strength, if anybody's ever played any kind of MMO, usually the warrior class is represented by some sort of axe, and so there's some innate mythos linked to that weapon, and that weapon representing strength. So let's give a little bit more context behind this weapon. In Christianity, the axe is actually a symbol of Saint Jude the Apostle, serving as the implement with which he was martyred. Some believe that St. Jude might have been Jesus' brother, so we've already got a theme. Simon the Zealot thought to be a brother of Jesus, so too was St. Jude. But the point is, the axe is an ancient symbol that can easily be linked to holy iconography, as well as being representative of the warrior archetype. So you have a sort of old Catholic symbol imbued with the iconography of the warrior archetype. It seems fitting that Simon, a man presented as a sort of holy barbarian warrior, should make use of an axe as a sub-weapon. Alright, so while we're on the thought of Simon's appearance, let's talk about his clothing. Judging from his sprite, it can be a little difficult to decide what style of clothing he's supposed to be wearing, but if we view it within the context of the box art, we see he's wearing this very antiquated set of clothing in an era where castles and clock towers exist. I think this might suggest that Simon is from a humble background. He's rugged, think like a mountaineer or a woodsman. His long hair seems to almost parallel that of the great biblical warrior Samson, who was said to have divine strength gifted to him by God. Okay, I think we're finally ready to talk about the castle of Castlevania. I mean, surely you guys are ready to talk about the actual castle, right? Okay, so there's one thing we got to talk about first. Well, we will get to this castle. We will get to the castle of Castlevania, but one thing I'd like to kind of look at first are the hearts. Remember the hearts? You know the hearts. Okay, so the hearts, I remember this confused me so much as a kid. In every other video game, the heart represents life. It replenishes your health, gives you hit points or health points. So why is it then that in Castlevania, hearts don't replenish your life? Instead, you just seem to collect them. That is, until you want to use your sub-weapon, then your heart collection gets used. I think most people by this point have sort of written this particular quirk of Castlevania off as just being a thing that Castlevania does. Hearts power weapons, meat powers life, it just is. But why? Well, I have some thoughts about this. So in order for it to work, we need to look at another piece of the Castlevania puzzle. That red orb thingy, or as the manual calls it, the magic crystal. It's an interesting note in the manuals that the crystal revives all lost power and can clear creatures from the entire stage. So that's a pretty powerful artifact. That's a pretty powerful weapon that Dracula in his possession, and so it makes sense that he would have his most powerful minions be guarding these magic crystals. So what is the significance of the magic crystal? Well, if we look at the geometry of it, it's a circle. Symbolically, a circle is considered the perfect shape. It's God's shape. The ancient Greeks used a circle dot, a monad, to represent the supreme being. When thought of in 3D space, a circle becomes a sphere, a symbol of order. In the Divine Comedy, specifically in Dante's Paradiso, heaven is represented and ordered into a series of spheres, with God at the center of it all. Then we consider the idea that this round item is a type of crystal. So we look at the color in particular. If it's a crystal, a red minerals that would form the red crystals could identify this material as cinnabar. Cinnabar is sort of an old name for a type of solid mercury. Normally when you think of mercury, you think of the silver liquid metal stuff you see in thermostats, but found out in the wild, if you go mining for this stuff, it's actually this sort of red ore, mercury ore. So way back then, cinnabar was considered to represent the Philosopher's Stone. Any fan of Full Metal Alchemist, you're probably familiar with the idea of searching for the Philosopher's Stone. That idea, that whole memological trope is much older than the anime. It's a very, very old idea of searching for this Philosopher's Stone. It represents the ultimate idea of transformation. From that point of view, when Simon collects the red crystal, it starts to make sense that this item transforms all of his collected hearts into health, and that's exactly what happens. So whenever you grab that crystal, it drains all of the hearts you've collected, and you are granted vitality. It's kind of a Tokugoku, right? If you're familiar with Full Metal Alchemist, you trade one thing and receive another. That's kind of what this red crystal does. So this crystal can also be a heliotrope, which is a type of jasper. Jasper in sort of the geological symbolism represents strength and courage, but perhaps most interestingly, jasper could represent cleansing, which is pretty cool because this matches up nicely with the manual describing this crystal as being able to clear the enemies off a stage. So whenever at the very end of the stage, when you grab that crystal, all of the enemies in that stage are gone. You've effectively cleansed that part of Castlevania. Another interesting thing, a heliotrope has another name. It's called Christ's Bloodstone and is a symbol of rebirth. So we have a magic crystal with lots of potential connections to rebirth and transformation that literally drains the hearts from Simon and restores Simon's life. That is pretty cool. Just getting all of that from a little red circle that you collect in a vampire game. I don't know if this was intentional, but it was interesting doing the research how many of these things lined up pretty nicely. So let's tie this to the hearts of Castlevania, because we still haven't really explained that, and so let's see what we can come up with. So the heart is an interesting concept. As an organ, the Egyptians believed the heart governed morality, while the Greeks thought it controlled reason. It wasn't until later that the heart took on its iconic shape when Christian Europeans began to use it to represent love between men and women, and between mankind and God. The heart symbol can also represent the Catholic concept of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It's the idea of Jesus's unlimited love for the world. The heart also represents a stereotypical weakness of vampires, so that's pretty interesting, right? Like you've got this divine symbol, and that also happens to be one of Dracula's weaknesses. Driving a stake through a vampire's heart is thought to be a sure way to permanently kill one. So what does it all mean? Why does Simon get hearts from attacking candlesticks? Why would Castlevania itself provide Simon with a means to defeat Dracula? Well, you could make the case that Castlevania is a representation of semi-contained chaos, and that the very nature of chaos itself isn't necessarily evil, although that is often the case, since goodness is typically defined as a narrow path, and anything outside that narrow path is chaotic. It's usually not good. So is the chaos of the castle itself generating hearts? I'm not so sure about that. I think because the way Simon obtains the hearts is a fairly predictable process. So there's an orderly process from which Simon transmutes these things into hearts. So it's almost a divinely ordered event, meaning that these magic crystals are such powerful artifacts of holy power that they bring a level of order to Castlevania. So much so that the castle reacts and converts from chaotic material, which it's often stated, if I can break game scope for just a second, it's stated in some of the other games that the castle is basically an embodiment of chaos. So when Simon is destroying pieces of this chaotic embodiment, in this case via Simon's magic whip, it is actually so potent that it just converts these pieces of Castlevania into holy power, which is represented by these little red hearts. This would explain why some enemies will also spontaneously drop hearts as well. Also, both enemies and candles burst into that same telltale red flame. It's that transmutive flame. So via the holy power in his whip, he's taking these chaotic entities and converting it into something good, which is actually also a theme in the Bible itself. The Bible often talks about how God uses evil and evil people for the purposes of good. So it's interesting. It all kind of ties in together. So now from a symbolic point of view, I think it's interesting that Simon must reach out and open up these various candlesticks in order to reveal hearts. Candlesticks and lamps represent knowledge, and so when Simon opens up knowledge, he is given power. But this can be viewed a little bit differently if you think about how reason can also be an enemy to faith. So if you think about the idea that reason is often linked with Satan, and that by attacking reason, you're given access to spiritual power from the heart, right? So you destroy reason to renew your faith, perhaps. That's a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of a ramble, but I thought it was interesting that you've got some basic symbols. One becomes another. It's an interesting thought. So now that we've kind of gotten through the introduction to Simon's arsenal, his clothing, his collection of weapons and sub-weapons, maybe we can actually start talking about the castle now. I don't think I have any other things to ramble about other than the castle itself. So let's talk about right at the start of the start. Here's the intro. The game starts in darkness with only the waxing moon to light Simon's way. Clouds drift over the moon, darkness obscuring light. It's an ominous sign. Simon is the light in a sea of black, his path obscured by that which he seeks to end. In the west, a waxing moon is a sign of life, but it is also a sign of chaos. In Japan, a waxing moon is often the symbol of rebirth. So again, we see themes of rebirth right here at the very start. The other prominent symbol in this scene are the big red gates barring entrance to the distantly placed Castlevania. Gates are portals, access points, and a boundary separating two places. In a way, Simon is stepping through a gate that separates the natural world from the unholy lands surrounding the dark castle. The gates themselves are red, a dark red. The color red is loaded with symbolism. We could probably make a whole separate video about just the color red, but we need to put some boundaries, some constraints on our discussion here for this to even make sense. So if we talk about the negative aspects of symbolism that is attributed to the color red, red can represent danger. Red is malice. As these gates swing open on their own volition to welcome Simon in, we get the sense that the castle itself is luring our hero in. So you're passing through these dangerous pillars that represent malice, represent potentially violence, blood. So continuing on, the castle approach. The approach to Castlevania is a bit unique. Normally, most games in this era start throwing enemies at you right at the start, but not here. The approach is bereft of enemies. You get a few torches that light your way, inviting Simon to test the strength of his whip. There are a few pieces of statuary here, but it's difficult to determine who the statues are supposed to be. My guess is that maybe it's supposed to be Dracula. It's supposed to be a count, maybe back when he was still immortal. But perhaps the castle is reflecting some part of Dracula's history, since it's a chaotic entity, but maybe it's influenced by Dracula. Maybe it's a reference to his Days as a grim impaler, and his collection of statues are a forest of impaled victims memorialized in stone. And as the powers of darkness warped him, so too did the flattering representations of his humanity begin to crumble into unrecognizable hunks of stone. The only thing these statues represent now is death. They're crumbling away. They're ancient. You can't even tell what they are anymore. So you get through this enemy-less approach, and you go into level 1, which I've called the Great Hall, because that's exactly what it is. It's a giant hallway. So here we are, the first full level of Castlevania. Now, as you might expect for a first level, the Great Hall is open and easy to traverse. There are no pitfalls, just a few basic enemies to deal with. The first is the zombie. Zombies have interesting social commentary sort of built into their mythos. A human that was dead but risen again. But unlike biblical Jesus or Lazarus, who were raised in a complete and pure state, zombies are a mockery of resurrection. They shamble around, unable to communicate anything more than moans and death rattles. They seek to consume the living. They propagate by devouring, even though their end goal isn't driven by any urge to spread their genes, which is another perversion of the idea and process of life. The other enemy you encounter, albeit briefly, is the Black Cat. Black Cat symbolism is pretty well known, I think, at this point. If you have any kind of clue, and if you celebrate Halloween at all, you're already sort of aware kind of innately about black cats, especially in the West. They're usually linked to ideas of horror and bad luck and evil. Cats, just from a biological standpoint, cats aren't particularly social, which can make them seem a bit mysterious to people. You add the social mystery mixed with the symbolic meaning of the color black, and you have a living avatar of bad omen. Finally, the last common enemy type you encounter is the Fishman. The Fishman is representative of the unknown. They jump out of the black watery depths to attack Simon. If the water represents a barrier between the conscious and subconscious parts of the human mind, then these fishmen, these bizarre and aberrant combinations of fish and man, are the creatures of nightmare come to drag you into the unknowable terror of your own dark side. The Great Hall itself is in ruins, furthering the overall theme of decay that ties nearly every level of Castlevania together. And just like we saw with the exterior gates of Castlevania, the Great Hall is decorated with that similar red color, giving off a sense that the Great Hall was once a place of splendor, but has now become twisted into a vestibule of violence. So let's move on to the first full boss in Castlevania. This takes place, of course, right at the end of the Great Hall. It's the giant bat. Bats, like most symbols, can mean a lot of things, but I think we can focus on the negative Western meaning due to the supernaturally large state of the bat in question. Bats live in caves, and caves can symbolically be viewed as gateways to the underworld or an entrance to hell. In Dante's Inferno, Dante enters hell through a dark cave in the earth. Bats only come out at night, further adding to the sort of exotic notoriety these creatures carry. And since some of these creatures even suck blood, it fits well into the idea of an evil, supernatural man that only comes out at night to be connected with bats. It begs the question, is the story of Dracula simply a human personification of the mysterious bat, or have bats simply been co-opted by the Prince of Darkness as his avatar of choice? Is it nature following form or form following nature? So, once we defeat the bat, we get into level 2. So let's take a look at level 2. I've called this level the Tower Approach since it seems to follow a mostly upward trajectory. One of the striking things about this stage is the color palette. Instead of the dingy grays and angry reds of the first level, we're given a series of muted purples and browns. Now, separately, these colors carry their own meaning, but I think it's important to view this palette as a singular symbol, and that symbol, of course, being darkness. These colors are so out of place that we're forced to sort of intuit an alternate meaning, that the stage we're looking at is actually meant to be conveyed as very darkly lit. You see this sort of trick used in some NES games where the entire color palette of stages are swapped for colder tones to represent the loss of light. This level is a sort of abstract dungeon, and I call it abstract to help delineate it from a much more concretely and stereotypically defined dungeon we'll see later in the game. Think of it. It's dark, which we can tell by the color palette. It's enclosed in stone, and you have these guard-like monsters roaming the platform. Simon is meant to be captured here as a victim of the many pitfalls we see in this level. Now, the first enemy Simon encounters in this stage is Medusa, more appropriately Medusa's head. So some quick background on Medusa if you weren't already aware. There are a couple of different Medusa stories, but I think the one most fitting for our purpose centers around a beautiful Grecian woman by the name of Medusa, so what makes Medusa's story so tragic is that in this particular version of the story that I'm thinking of is that Medusa was punished simply for being too pretty. She is the embodiment of the corrupted feminine form. Instead of feminine beauty, she sports the body of a grotesque snake and a face literally so terrifying and hideous that it turns men to stone. The story goes that a Greek hero by the name of Perseus enters Medusa's lair, which happens to be a cave, so we're going back to cave symbolism here, resists the temptation to look at her, there's a morality tale to be explored here, reducing the temptation to look at a feminine form, and then proceeds to behead Medusa. And then later on, he goes on to use Medusa's head to slay an even larger monster, in effect subjugating Medusa even further. So now not only is Medusa a corruption of the feminine ideal, but she is also an embodiment of hatred against Perseus, hatred and vengeance against the hero. And our hero in this case happens to be Simon. So Medusa is trapped in a sine wave attack pattern. It's as if she's chained to fate. Now I know this is kind of silly, but stay with me. She's always lashing out at whatever fool dares enter her lair. It's also worth noting that Medusa will only spawn from the side of the screen that Simon is facing. Probably reading too much into it, but I thought this was an interesting thought in that Medusa's power comes, at least from the Greek myth, Medusa's power comes from staring at her face. And in Castlevania, she attempts to always attack you head on. She always spawns in the direction that you're facing. So I thought that was an interesting. I don't know if it was a conscious decision. It might not have been. I think it's probably an intuitive decision, but it still was an interesting thought nonetheless. So let's talk about the other primary enemy in this stage. It's the Black Knight. The concept of the knight most would recognize as that of a man clad in armor and a symbol of chivalry and honor. Now, when we see a picture of a knight, they're usually portrayed in some heroic framing. In a way, Simon is a sort of American knight. And the reason I say American knight, I mean, sure, he was created by a Japanese company. Yes, his adventure probably takes place in Europe. And yes, from a chronological point of view, this game predates the founding of America, but the symbols tell us something a little different. If we can concede, maybe, if you're willing to concede that Simon represents the white knight of righteous hero, honor-bound to slay the dragon, Dracula, the son of the dragon, that's what the name literally means, then where is Simon's stereotypical knight's weapon? Where's the sword and shield? It's been replaced with a whip inspired by an American icon, and Castlevania itself inspired by American horror films. Simon might canonically be a European, but he is symbolically an American fighting off an Americanized horror. Okay, sorry, got a little carried away. So let's get back to the Black Knights. So if white knights are symbols of honor and heroism, then the Black Knight is a mirrored corruption of that symbol. Black Knights might be just as duty-bound as a white knight, but their duty is to the devil himself. They're honorless, happy to push Simon off an edge into that darkness. How many times has that happened to you during your playthrough? They're like the demons lining the rim of the fifth Bolgia in Dante's Inferno that specialize in keeping their victims entrapped in the black pitch. Except in the case of Castlevania, it's the pitch blackness. Then there's the ghost. Now, this is a weird enemy. So ghosts aren't necessarily a bad symbol, but as we've seen so often already, this ghost is malevolent, and so it only makes sense to look at the negative symbolism of ghosts. If you look carefully, the ghost is actually a floating skull. Skulls represent mortality and death. What makes this skull so unsettling is that it's kind of morphed into this abnormal shape, like an alien or a demon. What's more, this demonic skull is engulfed in blue flames. In the symbolic language of fire, blue generally occurs at the highest temperature of the flame. So it's usually at the base part of the flame, which, if you kind of look into sort of the ancient symbolism of fire, the lower part of the flame represents hell. Even the behavior of the enemy itself is symbolic. It appears behind Simon and slowly creeps towards him. It's mortality always chasing him. But it's a perversion of the natural order of mortality, seeking to strike Simon down before his time. The next enemy is an even stranger one, and it's going to require a few steps to try to piece together what the design is trying to tell us. I mean, just what the heck it is and what it even means. It is the Dragon Skull Cannon. Initially, when I saw this, I tried to sort of just intuit the meaning, because symbolism is often intuitive. But what was my gut telling me, basically, when I looked at this thing? I couldn't really translate my intuition into anything meaningful other than something like a rooted evil. So I decided to follow a different process here. Let's coin it as the symbol identification method. Basically, we're going to approach it like an engineer, and then we're going to break apart the different symbols and identify the symbols separately, and then maybe reassemble them, and maybe we get something out of it. Maybe we get some greater symbol out of the assembled symbols. So let's break it apart. So we've got a dragon, we've got a skull, and a cannon. So dragons are loaded with symbolism, but again, we need to narrow the focus of what meanings make the most sense given the context they're presented in. So in this case, the dragon is a symbol of evil and is Dracula's, or should I say Dracul's, namesake. Dragons can also carry a satanic reference, since dragons can be serpent-like in appearance, and snakes and dragons are biblically linked to Satan. Dragons and Dracula, avatars of evil. Then we have the skull. Now, as mentioned before, the skull represents mortality and more negatively death, especially when we're talking about a dragon skull. So you've got the combination of the ideas of evil and death and Dracula. Okay, so far so good. Finally, we have the cannon. This one's a little tricky. Cannons can symbolize the military. So usually if a cannon is represented on a flag or some sort of coinage, it's a good chance it's meant to represent military might. It seems appropriate that since Vlad the Impaler was a ruler and military leader when he was alive, that he would possess some military symbols. Of course, in this case, the cannon represents an army of darkness. It's worth noting that cannons can only attack. Some weapons can be used both offensively and defensively, like a sword or a spear, but guns and artillery have no physical defensive properties. Now, yes, they can deter an attack, and you can certainly say that the deterrence is a defense, but I'm speaking to the direct physical properties of the cannon. Well, I suppose you could hide under the cannon, but maybe you get my point. So we have the constituent parts of what comprises the enemy. So let's try to reassemble them. So we have an enemy that looks to be growing out of the ground and embodies the shape of its master's namesake, the dragon. It has this tree-like platform, and each cannon is a leaf on a branch. It's as if the castle itself is growing weapons to attack Simon. This weapon represents the will of Castlevania itself and bears out that to some degree it has an affinity for its master, and we kind of touched on this before about how the Castlevania is influenced by Dracula himself. This is in contrast to the candles that contain power-ups for Simon, so maybe these cannons are the antithesis to the candles. If chaos can sometimes yield good things, it can certainly and probably more often than not yield bad things. The Dragon Skull Cannon is the answer to the candles, in my view. Instead of fire to illuminate Simon's path, it is fire to destroy Simon. So the boss of this level is Queen Medusa, the second boss in Castlevania. So all of the previous symbolism that applied to the Medusa head enemies, well, you're going to be shocked to hear this actually also applies to Queen Medusa. I know that's it's a revelation, right? So let's talk about some of the other symbols that appear here. So first off, we have the surface level evaluation of the boss's regal title. She is ostensibly Queen of the Medusas. Perhaps she's even the Medusa, and all the other Medusas are actually her spawn. In fact, one of her attacks employs the snakes that stand in for her hair. And remember, snakes represent deceit, evil, Lucifer. Her snake hair falls to the ground and slithers aggressively towards Simon before disappearing off screen. I kind of like to think that these snakes might transform into the various flying Medusa heads we see throughout the entire game. Another interesting aspect to this boss is that she starts out as a statue of a beautiful woman seemingly in a dormant state. And it isn't until Simon gets close that Queen Medusa emerges from the statue to attack. This is another reference, of course, to the Greek tale where Medusa was once a beautiful woman, was twisted into a monster, and then was ultimately slain and used by a hero. It's also interesting that in her statue form, Queen Medusa appears to be resting in what looks like a holy shrine of sort. Since this is Castlevania, it isn't a stretch to assume this holy-looking shrine is actually a profane place of worship instead of a divine place of worship. And it's a profane place of worship for the hideous queen. Or maybe Dracula set her here as a sign of respect from one member of nobility to another, the Prince of Darkness marking out a special place for the Queen of the Gorgons. Finally, we have Queen Medusa's attack pattern. She's the only enemy in the game that causes the screen to flash as she attacks, and she's also the only enemy that directly faces the player. It's sort of a fourth wall breaking mechanic where the screen flashes, drawing the player's attention to Queen Medusa's twisted visage. It's like she's trying to turn the player to stone, just as she did to so many other would-be heroes in her past. So let's move on to level 3, the Allure. And I've called it the Allure because that's what it looks like. And if you aren't familiar with castle architecture, an Allure is the flat walkway area between the flat walkway area behind a parapet. In this case, this allure serves as a way to connect the Great Hall and external tower with the main castle structure of Castlevania. Now, right off the bat, you'll notice it's still fairly dark, but you can make out statuary. But this group of statuary is different from what we saw standing outside the entrance. Whereas the statuary leading into Castlevania looked like it might have been a male figure, perhaps even Dracula himself, this statuary looks more feminine to me. It seems appropriate that Queen Medusa would be defending these female statues. Maybe these little monuments were statues of herself, or reminded her of her lost beauty, or sort of a lost beauty that she covets now. Or perhaps they were rivals to her power that she encased in stone forever. The first enemy we run into while crossing the Allure is the Hunchback. This enemy both plagued and fascinated me as a child. Its weird, jittery, unpredictable movements made it a frustrating little foe. I really hated this thing. It was hard to hit, hard to run away from. Just what is this thing? It's a Hunchback. We meet the Hunchback shortly exiting an area that looks like a chapel. I think the religious structure that precedes this enemy makes an unmistakable reference to the Hunchback of Notre Dame. That's probably what most people are familiar with that term, where they've probably heard it from. The enemy is permanently squatted over into a deformed posture. The symbolism of the Hunchback is steeped in French history, specifically a character called Monsieur Meillet. He was a sort of mascot for the French Revolution, a kind of jester that could deliver political opinion in sort of a non-threatening or entertaining way. It's interesting that in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, in this case, the Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, not the Disney version, Quasimodo is a sympathetic character that goes on to commit acts of violence against the people of France, but only at the command of his benefactor Claude Frollo. It's the idea of the amusing jester being twisted into something evil. It's an idea that's still very compelling in modern media, and there's a mirror here. Quasimodo served an evil man, Claude Frollo. The Hunchbacks of Castlevania 2 serve darkness. They serve an evil man, Dracula himself. So what does it all mean? I think here it shows that even the sympathetic fool, the embodiment of satire, or perhaps the jester archetype, can be twisted towards evil. There is no room for a good laugh in Castlevania. The next enemy we see is the Raven. There's lots of symbolism behind this animal, but we're going to try to zero in on the negative horror symbolism on this difficult creature. Ravens are traditionally thought to be bad omens, signs of evil, either past or present. In fact, groups of ravens are usually called flocks, but they can also be called a congress of ravens, an unkindness of ravens, and my personal favorite, a treachery of ravens. They likely get their reputation from being scavengers that eat the dead. Most carrion birds in general tend to remind us of death and the unpleasant realities of what happens to our dead bodies over time. Much like the skull, ravens remind us of our mortality. Moving along the level, we get our first glimpse of the final area in the game. It's Dracula's Keep. It hangs ominously in the distance to remind you and Simon that governing all this evil is the Prince of Darkness himself. It's the Dark Tower. It's the Eye of Sauron, the glowering evil. What makes it even more unsettling is that the Keep defies, or perhaps defiles, the laws of physics. appearing to only be supported in the air by a thin stairway. It's just another reminder of the supernatural nature of Castlevania and the inversion of the natural order. Finally, at the end of the level, we get a 2-for-1 special with the twin mummy fight. This is pretty interesting to me. So usually mummification was reserved for important people, since the process itself was incredibly time-consuming and typically highly ritualized. Now, just who might these mummies have been in life? Well, mummies have a somewhat shared symbolic lineage with the zombies in terms of the dead returning to life, but I think mummies stand in a separate, elevated hierarchy given their possible royal status. So mummies seem to have more of a mystical or perhaps ancient magic associated with their origins, as to the more stereotypically industrial or virological or necromantic origins of zombies. Also, these mummies have a peculiar attack. That's right, these mummies attack with hostile bolts of cloth. Now, this may seem silly to a Western audience, but this might be a reference to a mythological Japanese monster called the Etan Momen. The Etan Momen has a lot of the same mummy backstory. It's usually a royalty or some other important figure who is mummified but then is brought back to life via some sort of curse or desire to fulfill a grudge. Except with the Etan Momen, it attacks with, you guessed it, it's bandages, hostile bolts of cloth. So when Simon beats the mummies, he must deal with the final curse of the mummy as the floor gives way and Simon is cast into darkness. Now, this is a classic storytelling as well as a powerful symbolic device. It's the symbol of the fall. Falls can be physical, metaphorical, or both. It represents a disintegration of the familiar, a tearing away of the things that aren't critical for survival. The one who falls must then pull it all back together, though not always completely. Typically, when we recover from a fall, be it a physical or a metaphorical one, we return with a sense of caution as to what caused the fall. We carry with us knowledge of how to avoid that fall again, and perhaps a resolve we couldn't have obtained any other way. Simon is no different. He is cast into the pit, and it's from the pit he must climb, his ascent to destiny. We awaken in the darkness of hell, or at least the darkness of a cave. We've already talked about cave symbolism when we mentioned the bats, and it's no less applicable here. In fact, this particular analog to hell is even more fitting considering its contents. In the background, we see what but human remains, piles of bones grouped in unceremonious mass graves. Could these be where Dracula discards his victims, or perhaps metaphorically, do these remains represent the weakness cast off during the Great Fall? What is weak must die. What survives, survive for a reason. What survives will continue onward. Once Simon finally climbs out of the cavern, out of the maw of hell, he ascends into nature. Here in the wilds just outside the main castle, we're granted a brief reprieve from the evil of Castlevania, but not a respite from harm. Here we run into a strange combination of enemies. We have the eagles carrying hunchbacks. The new aspect here is the eagle. I'll admit, being American, it's difficult to not innately attach positive, patriotic meaning to eagles, and I'm not the only one. Birds of prey in general usually get favorable symbolic treatment throughout history as symbols of strength, might, and pride. Perhaps even more interesting is that eagles can also be symbolic of the sun, and the sun is about as antithetical to vampires as it gets. So what's going on here? Well, the only thing I could really piece together was that eagles can also be a symbol of nature. It's not as a strongly associated symbol that we usually associate eagles with, but nature can be one of those, and nature is often amoral. It doesn't have favorites. So since Simon emerges out into nature, it seems fitting that he might encounter some of nature's inhabitants. Nature tends to be chaos contained within the bindings of survival. So really, if you're out in nature and you're successful, it is only because you are able to survive, and it isn't for any other reason. It's a built-in Darwinian law of existence. But what about the hunchbacks? My thought is maybe these hunchbacks have gone completely feral, too wild to make useful servants to Dracula, too unruly to reintegrate into civil society. These hunchbacks are carried by the avatars of nature to do nature's bidding, to survive, to scavenge. And since Simon is a symbol of goodness seeking to restore order, this could put him at odds with a typically amoral, generally chaotic force like nature. Gela Dragon. Here we have another combination of symbols. We have two symbols we've previously discussed, the skeleton and the dragon, but it's presented to us in a different configuration. This time, although this enemy is anchored, it moves quickly, slithering like a snake as it seeks to attack Simon with fireballs. The serpentine nature and snakes in general are a classic symbol of Satan, the ultimate enemy to man. Snakes are also associated with vengeance. So vengeance, whether we're talking about man's constant vigilance against the evil the snake represents, or the snake's resentment of God who cursed the snake to crawl in its belly and have its head bruised by the descendants of Adam as punishment for tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden. This section of the game is a sort of eye of the storm. It is basically the halfway point of the game. You've just finished the third level. There's only 6 stages, so it quite literally is the halfway point of the game. And it provides a point of relative calm and a break in the castle scenery. So when we started the game, we had this little calm entryway into the castle. This kind of reminds me of that. You've got sort of this calm, straightforward chunk of the game where you've got the castle scenery, but it's very brief. It's just like the intro. It's very brief, and before long, you're reaching the entrance to the castle sewers. And in order to get into the sewers, you scramble through this narrow entryway that leads us back into the evil of Castlevania, and opens up into a large man-made structure. So already we're throwing all that nature away. We're back into pure evil chaos. This vestibule serves as a sort of transition from nature back into the familiar castle environment. It seems fitting that we run into the next boss here, in the sewers, in a place where refuse, waste, and the unwanted are cast. Of course, I'm talking about Frankenstein. So, something a bit obnoxious about the naming of this enemy is that the naming is probably wrong. Frankenstein is the name of the doctor who created a monster. The creature we see Simon fight was probably meant to be called Frankenstein's monster. Most people tend to understand this common misapprehension of naming, so I won't belabor the point. I'm sure you've heard it a million times before. The only thing I'm going to say is that I'm going to, when I refer to Frankenstein, I'm actually just talking about Frankenstein's monster, but just understand that I'm probably just going to call him Frankenstein. So, back to the sewers. In this place of cast-off things, we see the ultimate mockery of the human form and a violation of the holy provenance of man. Its existence is an affront to the natural process of reproduction, a circumvention of natural law. The monster is a cautionary tale of what happens when the intellect is allowed to do what it will, following reason and reason alone, with no reins of morality to hold it in check. Was this monster assembled by the famous literary Dr. Frankenstein? Perhaps this is some alchemical creation devised by Dracula himself. This Frankenstein is slow-moving and invulnerable to all damage except for its head. I feel the game is sort of trying to train us up a little ahead of time with this mechanic, getting us used to the idea that sometimes only the head of the enemy is vulnerable. If Frankenstein represents the defilement of the dead and a profanity against the natural-born man, then Igor represents the cunning enabler. The classic trope is that Dr. Frankenstein needs a thief, a man of low moral fiber, in order to rob graves and carry out the foul deeds necessary to defy God's will. So ingrained in this idea of a disfigured, immoral assistant to Dr. Frankenstein that it can be surprising to find out that Igor was not in the original Mary Shelley novel. Another interesting aspect to this version of Igor is that he's invulnerable to damage. When Simon strikes him with the whip, Igor is stunned in place, but eventually regains mobility and resumes his aggressive leaping assault on our hero. So what does this all mean? A lumbering monster with an invincible sidekick. I think in this case, Igor is a representation of the id. It's this compulsive and instinctual part of our brain. Here, Igor attacks Simon as almost an extension of Frankenstein's animosity. He's an obstacle to overcome rather than an enemy to be defeated. Another thought I had was that maybe Igor, already being a man of low character, is corrupting the default amoral nature of Frankenstein to commit evil. After all, earlier in this level, we're confronted with strong themes of nature that eventually lead back into the evil structures of Castlevania. Perhaps here we see a parallel in that Igor, the embodiment of man's evil nature, is seeking to corrupt an intellectual and moral blank like Frankenstein into sin. Neutral swayed to evil, nature twisted to corruption. Stage 5. It's the main dungeon. So after Simon emerges from the sewers and aqueducts of Castlevania, we find our hero in what can only be described as the main dungeon. This is an interesting counterpoint to Stage 2. Stage 2 is what I referred to as a metaphorical dungeon. There were no cages or prison cells. It was just darkness and abyss to be pushed into by patrolling guards. In contrast, this stage seems to be brightly lit. It seems Dracula is happy for you to see the horror of this place. If Stage 2 was meant to be more of an obstacle for would-be adventurers and crusaders, this place is meant to imprison and inflict suffering upon the Dark Master's fallen and failed enemies. Oh yeah, this place is well lit because the suffering is meant to be visible. The prisoners are meant to see each other. The first enemy we run into here is the Axeman. This enemy is basically an upgraded version of the Black Knight, but there's something different going on here. Whereas the standard Black Knight enemy seemed appropriately placed in level 2 with their spears meant to cast Simon into the abyss, these Axemen behave a little more tactically. Rather than guards that torture the defenseless, this enemy is equipped for battle. It's as if Dracula has specifically commissioned these unholy soldiers to search for Simon and search for him with that axe. Remember, we've already discussed the axe as a holy symbol. What about the darker symbolism of the axe? Well, the axe can also be a strong symbol of execution and the executioner. These aren't just hapless denizens of Castlevania. These aren't just zombies roaming the Great Hall. They are the soldiers of Dracula's army of darkness. Other than a change in tactics and weaponry, these Axemen largely share the same roots of symbolism as the Black Knights. The other unique enemy we find is one of the most symbolic enemies in all of Castlevaniadom. It's the Red Skeleton. These skeletons carry all the same symbolism as their redless brethren and then some. These skeletons are unkillable. When Simon attacks them, they collapse in a heap only to rise again. The red in this case has a strong tie to blood. And since this enemy can revive over and over, it echoes the modus operandi of Dracula himself. Dracula never truly dies, but just resurrects himself. If we can entertain the idea that Dracula might be a sort of alchemical genius that could possibly create a Frankenstein's monster, is it possible he could create an immortal skeleton from his own blood? Now there's an interesting thought. If skeletons are normally symbols of man's mortality, then does an unkillable skeleton defy and corrupt even the natural idea that man is mortal? This makes even more sense when you consider that Dracula himself is an immortal creature that seems to be immune to death, a defiant exon of God's will. So basically, if the skeleton represents man's death, then the unkillable skeleton represents the unkillable nature of Dracula. Alright, near the last length of this level we see coffins and what appears to be solid black portraits. The coffins are strong symbols of death, the end of not just the cycle of life. Coffins can also denote status. Long ago, only the very wealthy could afford ornate coffins like these. Does that mean that owing to the multiple coffins we see that there was a group of nobility associated with Castlevania? And another thing, while a brand new empty coffin carries some inherent symbolism of foreboding, a coffin that was formerly occupied is probably even worse. The black portraits we see here have an interesting history. In the MSX version of the game, these portraits actually feature a picture of an old aristocratic man, possibly and probably the Count himself. However, in the NES version, the portrait is black. It may sound strange, but I like this a little better from a symbolic standpoint. According to vampire convention, vampires can't see their own reflection. Perhaps Dracula seeing portraiture of his original human form enraged him. After all, if you're in defiance of mortality, why would you want to be reminded that you were once mortal? So perhaps Dracula destroyed or defaced the portraits of himself, leaving both Simon and the player to wonder just what used to be in those frames. And this also ties back to the statuary that we saw at the very beginning of the game. The statues look crumbled, defaced. You can't really tell what they're supposed to be. So if they were statues of Dracula, maybe he also destroyed those, maybe for similar reasons. So at the end of this level, we have the Grim Reaper, also called Death. He's about as self-explanatory and spot on as it gets when it comes to symbolism. He's come to reap your soul with a giant farming implement, while also flinging said farming implement at you. His face is a skull, his body is a skeleton, and he's cloaked in black. He might be one of the coolest enemies in the game, and maybe one of the more interesting characters in the franchise, but his symbolism is basically spelled out for the player. And honestly, there's just not a whole lot to interpret here that isn't painfully obvious. He is the literal and figurative embodiment of death, named Death, here to send Simon to his death. How appropriate, then, that the Grim Reaper was guarding the next area, the Clock Tower. If the Grim Reaper is the embodiment of death, then the Clock Tower is a giant edifice to mortality. Every tick marking another moment gone forever, another sliver of Simon's vitality, yours and mine, lost forever. Time, it is the unrenewable resource. But before you reach the clock tower itself, Simon passes through a small transition to the tower that serves as almost an inversion to the Allure level. What's more is this area is guarded by giant bats. These avatars are heavy-handed references to the Count himself. In the final stretch between the castle and the keep, we see this interesting entrance. It's adorned with a large bird wolf statue. Again, we're going to have to use a similar method that we used for the dragon skull cannons. We're going to break these symbols apart, and we get a bird, which singularly can be a symbol of resurrection. And then you have the wolf, which in Christian symbolism can be a symbol of the wilds or a symbol of evil. The wolf can also symbolize Rome, specifically pagan Rome. When we combine the bird and the wolf together, we get something like a symbol of nobility, like a echo from Rome, combined and corrupted by the influence of Castlevania. Corrupted nobility, resurrected. It's basically a symbolic description of Dracula himself, albeit in an iconopictograph the size of a door. Finally, we get to this classic and ominous scene from Castlevania. It's a clock face with no hands, frames the moon with a red carpet leading to the final conflict. Having just passed through the clock tower, this is an interesting detail. The clock cannot tell time. It cannot tick away the slivers of life. If we wanted to make a clock face represent immortality, then a clock face with no way of marking time, thereby making time meaningless, would be the way to do it. Then we have the moon, again representing rebirth, the night, and chaos. Finally, the bit of red carpet. The red that has featured so prominently through the game as a symbol of violence, malice, and perhaps more importantly, blood. All of these symbols combined, this whole scene, what does it say? It represents Dracula and all his ambition, its immortal evil, its endless life fueled by endless blood, with chaos and eternal night ruling over all. As Simon presses on, we see an open coffin, Dracula's temporary resting place, a permanent residence for the dead, defied and rejected. We're here. It's the Count Dracula, the Prince of Darkness. Right from the start, notice that Dracula towers over Simon. I think this is a good mirror of the intro to Castlevania, where Simon marches up to the perimeter of the gates and we see Castlevania looming high in the distance. Now we have the imposing figure of the Count looming over Simon. One final challenge, one final source, perhaps the biggest source of evil for Simon to purge. Dracula is robed in a huge red cloak, becoming a living symbol and embodiment of malice and violence. What's more, that cloak appears to protect him against all damage, which speaks to the power Dracula receives from blood. Drac is also wearing a little bling. Generally speaking, jewelry denotes nobility, but there can be a lot of symbolic nuances depending on the type of jewelry and its origins. Since this particular piece appears to be a locket, it begs the question, whose likeness resides in the locket around Dracula's neck? Give me some of your theories. I have a few of my own, but it would break our game scope we established at the beginning, so I'll save that for another episode. Generally speaking, vampires are often represented as wealthy and attractive men or women. They're sort of symbolic warnings of what can happen when you give in to your lust. Sleeping with a vampire can be a draining experience, to say the least, but here it looks like the Count is, well, ugly. Could it be that the Count's resurrection was incomplete? Or perhaps this is the true face of evil. Maybe Dracula is normally this ugly creature, and since he has no need to charm Simon, he can just sport his normal horrific visage. Dracula has two basic attacks, teleportation and fireballs. His teleportation is seemingly random, representing Dracula's mastery over sorcery, but also a symbolic show of chaos at work, as sometimes Dracula can teleport across the screen, and other times he appears right on top of Simon. Fire can also be a strong symbol of chaos, and given the context of where the fire is coming from, a strong symbol for hell. Once Dracula takes enough damage, he becomes desperate, and he unleashes his true power by becoming a giant humanoid bat. This is an interesting callback and inversion of the first boss of the game. The giant bat from the first level hovers near the top of the stage and swoops down at Simon, but here, Dracula's second form stays on the ground and periodically swoops or jumps upwards into the air. So it's the exact opposite fight pattern. It's in this form that Dracula has shed all pretense of nobility, humanity, tactics, and sorcery. He's become a monster in totality, and it seems to ever be man's destiny to destroy monsters. Perhaps it's even your destiny to destroy a monster. And there we have it. Castlevania is an entity of chaos anchored to this world by the evil of Dracula himself. With its master destroyed, or at the very least beaten into dormancy, the unholy edifice of archaic and arcane evil loses its footing in the natural world and crumbles into rubble as our protagonist looks on. Simon's status as a hero is solidified as he walks off into the sunset, an idyllic way to end a game rooted in Western cinema and chock full of symbolism. And so that's it. That's the symbolism of Castlevania. I know I missed a few symbols, but I think I might make a shorter video to kind of round up the handful that I think are worth mentioning. But really, I just wanted to say, if you managed to make it this far and put up with me for this long, I just want to sincerely thank you for watching this video, for considering the things that I've rambled on about. I really do think that these symbols matter. I mean, they don't just appear in video games. These symbols have been around for a long time. And really, I want to make it my mission to try to find more symbols in video games and to draw them back to sort of ancient wisdom and the wisdom of our forefathers. I know there's kind of a tendency nowadays to try to draw messaging to modern media, and that's all well and good, but that's not what my focus is going to be. I really think that there is something to be said about old knowledge and how it sort of propagates forward. And so hopefully that's shown through in this. So anyway, I'm going to do more. And I'm always open for suggestions. If you have a good idea for a video game that you think contains some of these ancient symbols, let me know, and I'll take a look at it. Other than that, all I have to say is see you next time.